But I think it's a great exercise to kind of take stock of like, okay, if we subtract out running kids to practices, if we subtract out going to punch a clock or, doing the things that we have to do, like what is left? And to me, those are the things that I think get lost as we go through life. And it's a way to kind of take an inventory, take stock of like, how do you feel your day? Because I think without some type of like structure or some type of intention, we can get lost.
Tim, in our last episode, we talked about creating some more freedom before retirement through developing a sabbatical mindset. We talked about how taking some extended time off can be an interesting window into retirement and what that might look like. And so I want to continue that conversation today. And to kick us off, one of the things that I was thinking about is so much of retirement planning and the discussion around retirement planning focuses on, do I have enough? Right? What is that nest egg number? How much do I need to have saved for retirement? But I think what is the harder question, which is not, do I have enough, but what am I retiring to? What does that retirement phase look like? And so, question to kick us off here is, why do you think it's so common that people can spend decades planning for retirement, but very little time planning for what retirement itself is going to look like?
Yeah, it's probably a combination of a few things. Like I think that we get distracted or preoccupied by like the numbers. So, it's almost like I kind of equate it to like gas prices. Like people freak out when gas prices go up, and rightfully so. But at the end of the day, like it's probably a smaller percentage of like what you overall pay to like run your household, but you drive by it every day, right? So it's like right in your face. So I think the same is true from a retirement perspective where, you might see colleagues retire. Maybe you're looking at your statements a little bit more closely. Um, I think it's you might be getting things like from Social Security or AARP, things like that. So I think that drives a little bit of um, the bandwidth in terms of like how you view retirement. I think the other thing is like, I think it's just a bigger stressor. Like, do I have enough? Am I going to run out of money? What are the unforeseen things? And I think you view it as like retirement as like, you don't have that safety net of a paycheck coming in. So like what you have at the end of the day with, before you retire is what you have. Um, and I think that what do you retire to is viewed as like retirement, as we talked about, it's often viewed as like the destination, the
Yeah.
finish line, or like almost like, hey, I've gone on vacation before and I vacation well. I can do that for a longer period of time. So it's like, what could go wrong? Or I'll just figure it out as I go. All right. So I think some people do this really well. It's kind of like on the fly. They can kind of shift and take off that pharmacist hat role and be the retiree, be the grandparent, be the, maybe daycare for grandkids or whatever that is. But I think others, like, we've talked about in previous episodes, it's not as easy for some people,
Yeah.
right? So I think it's a combination of just like what is in front of your face, what you're getting in the mail, other people's experience. And I think we view what I'm going to do in retirement, I'm just going to figure it out. And I'm just going to, maybe iterate and see what works for me, what doesn't work for me. And we know, again, that there's a lot of people that struggle with that at the end of the day.
Yeah, I was thinking a lot about this as we were going into the recording today. And I think as you alluded to, one of the aspects here that stands out to me is probably the obvious surface level, which is so much of the attention around retirement focuses on the number, right? Do we
Yeah.
have enough? And we've talked about that many times on the show. The big scary nest egg number that for some that are closer to that can feel very real. For those that are 20 years away, even if you're in the middle of your career, it's still kind of fuzzy, right? But I think if we go a little bit deeper on this, I have a hypothesis that I think focusing on the number, while that can feel scary, is actually the easier work because it's objective, right? It's not, I mean, it has an emotional component to it, but it's a calculator, it's a spreadsheet, it's a target, it's a number. I think when we get to this discussion around like, what are we retiring to? And are we ready to retire, not just financially, but also in terms of how we're going to be spending our time and what that looks like, depending on our kind of individual situation. And obviously, every one of us is unique. I think that can be scary, right? Because it gets into some of the other types of conversations like, well, how am I spending my time? Or like we talked about on episode 440 of our identity that can be tied up in the work that we do, right? Who am I independent of the work that I do? Who am I independent of raising my kids or being a spouse, right? And what do my relationships look like? How am I spending my time in terms of hobbies or pursuit of other things? And I think that can be scary in some situations. And we'll talk a little bit about preparing for that here in a bit, but I'd love to just hear your reflection on that, right? Because I think that the financial stuff is very, of course it's real, um, but it's somewhat objective as well.
Yeah, I think to your point, what am I retiring to? I think is more of an abstract construct versus like I need $2 million in my IRA, 401k combo for me to like that's easier for most people to wrap their brain around. I think for a pharmacist too, right? And if you've ever gone through, trials and trials in life, like sometimes we don't deal with those, so we just kind of like we don't process those properly, or like that's a problem for another day. And it's almost like, if you're going through life, a busy career, family, marriage, things like that, like you're just trying, at least this is how I feel, Tim, you're just trying to like survive the day, and you're not really processing or maybe not going that deep with yourself or even relationships. Like I've talked about
Yeah.
this, like I don't want to get to a point where the kids are gone and then I'm like, hi Shay, my name is Tim, like good to meet you again. Right. And that happens in marriages. So I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense, where it's just like we put those things on the back burner, and we're like, okay, we'll figure it out when we get there. And I think success for most people is trying to kick the tires on that before you actually get there. And I think that's why we were talking about, whether you can take a mini sabbatical or an extended vacation or staycation to kind of mock what this looks like. I think the better, because again, the things we talked about with depression and alcohol use, like those things are real in retirement. And I think they're becoming more prevalent because we just don't talk about it enough. We don't talk about the life plan inside enough in retirement. We talk about, yeah, like is money going to run out? Those
Right.
types of things. Are you on track? When should you claim Social Security, which in the grand scheme of things is important, but not necessarily important in terms as important, I think, as like, are you living a wealthy life in retirement? What is purpose? What are we trying
Yeah.
to accomplish? I think one of the best questions that we ask throughout the planning process is like, what does success look like? Because again, it's a very open-ended question that may have to do with money, but for the most part, it doesn't. It's kind of more of it kind of flips that script, so to speak, where the abstract becomes more real and the support and documentation is the money. It's not the main course. And I just don't think that we do that enough, because I think everything, and again, we talk about the pharmacist's brain. The pharmacist's brain is checklists. It's reaching goals. It's, am I fully optimized? And a lot of that is more related to my taxes and, do I have enough save? Am I invested properly? Do I have an efficient portfolio? how am I gonna like what does Medicare look like year to year? How am I gonna claim Social Security? And I think we lose sight of, I think, the things that are most important, which are the qualitative, abstract concepts related to retirement.
Yeah, and I think the risk we run, I'm thinking about if the nest egg number, the retirement number is the focus, the risk that we run there is that we're reinforcing the concept that retirement is a finish line and
Yeah.
not a transition, right? That's the mindset shift I think that we need to begin to try to make, is that retirement is a significant milestone, no question about it. But many people are going to live hopefully 20, 30, 40 years in retirement, right? That is a big transition to be considering. And, if we have a nest egg number of 3 or 4 million and we're doing all the planning work and we're thinking about asset location, all the things, if we're on track to accomplish that, we can run into the trap of, hey, I'm good, right? I'm on track. That's the finish line. If I'm not on track, of course, work that we need to do, but again, we're positioning that still as the finish line. And what we're trying to do here is merge some of the quantitative and the qualitative. And Tim, I think one of the things that's so helpful here, and for those that are near retirement, let's say within the next 5 years, I think it's easier to put your arms around this type of exercise that I'm going to ask you to talk through here in a moment, where somebody who's maybe 15, 20, 25 years out, not so much. But even for that group, I still think this is very valuable because it helps you to think about what are some of the things that I want to be doing now to kind of prepare myself, not just financially, but also emotionally and relationally for retirement. And that activity I'm referring to is one that you do in the life planning process around developing the ideal schedule, right? Because again, we're going to be spending several decades, hopefully in retirement. And if we view it as a finish line and we get there and we haven't put as much thought into like, what does a mundane Tuesday look like? What does a mundane August look like when kids are out of the house, work isn't present, right? There's a lot more capacity for time. Talk through a little bit more about that exercise as a part of the life planning process and why that's so valuable and what can come to life from that.
Yeah. So kind of read my mind, Tim. So ideal schedule, fresh off the press. I printed this morning, kind of in anticipation of my sabbatical and like going through, what this actually looks like. So for people that are not watching this video, I'm holding up the ideal schedule exercise that we do as part of the life planning. And it kind of goes through the ideal day, the ideal week, and then the ideal year. And the exercise is basically to, if you strip away things like, and it could be work, but like, what are how are you actually like time blocking, or how are you creating a schedule that would be absolutely ideal for you? When do you wake? When do you fall asleep? Are you sleeping in? Are you taking a walk on a beach? And you're basically, and I think, I think doing this pen to paper is a good exercise, but I think it brings to light, how much of our time, especially in the accumulation phase, is really dictated by our careers. And when you take that away, it's kind of like, okay, what am I actually doing? So I think it's a great exercise to slow down and, go through and, I think for me, I always make the joke that like the ideal day in the template, it starts at 7 a.m. I'm like, that's not
No,
me,
no thanks.
no thanks. Now for Tim Albrecht, absolutely. But then on the back end, like I'm going to bed at 11 or midnight because I'm more of a night owl, and you're already been probably sleep for a couple hours. So, to me, it's, as I went through this morning, I look at my morning, it's coffee and breakfast. Maybe I'm making something on the griddle, then maybe I'm doing some type of like movement or activity, a walk, gym, bike ride, lunch. Maybe after lunch, it's a hammock and a book, writing, maybe a home project, and then kind of getting, maybe doing some shopping for dinner and grilling something, clean up, maybe watch a movie, burn some wood, go in the spa, maybe a whiskey and a cigar, and then off to bed. So like, to me, that sounds like an amazing day. That at kind of the core of, where I would be, but obviously that's not going to be every day. So maybe I'm volunteering, maybe we're traveling, but I think it's a great exercise to kind of take stock of like, okay, if we subtract out running kids to practices, if we subtract out, um, going, don't going to punch a clock or, doing the things that we have to do, like what is left? And to me, those are the things that I think get lost as we go through life. And it's a way to kind of take an inventory, take stock of like, how do you fill your day? Because I think without some type of like structure or some type of intention, we can get lost. And then I think it turns into some of those things, that we've talked about in terms of depression or, just unhealthy habits, that type of thing. So to me, the life planning process of like, we start with the 3 questions, the heart's core grid, the ideal schedule, and the goals for life kind of encapsulate this, what is it that you're passionate about? How do you want to spend the time? And again, it can be very, adjacent or removed from the dollars and cents that often dominate the conversation when we talk about retirement.
I think we're kind of operating under assumption that there's going to be a base level of dollars and cents in a nest egg available.
Yeah,
And again, we need to be able to chew gum and walk at the same time, right? So,
correct.
even if we're not on track financially, well, we need to figure out the plan to get on track, and we need to be thinking about these other things as well. Um, and a couple things were coming up as you were going through that. I think that there's a ton of value in the pen to paper of that exercise, right? Because it's easy, in my opinion, to over glorify the picture of retirement and to stop at that point, right? So even as you were talking, I was writing down the things that I would love to have more time to do. Love to read, would love to have more time to read, would love to even have a little bit more time for vacations and travel, even a little bit more space or margin for working out, more time for cooking, more time for family and experiences. So putting pen to paper with those, like those are all great. But even as you said, you look at one of those days and you're like, that sounds awesome, but I'm not going to do that every day. Right. Um, and so that gets to that kind of mindset of like retirement is not vacation. I mean, there might be a little bit of that honeymoon phase in retirement. But it helps us also see like, what are some of the opportunities now that we want to focus on in preparation for that, whether we're 3 years out or we're 20 years out, right? Because even as I list out those things, they feel amazing because there's no margin to do those in this phase of life, right? But there's going to be a lot more margin to do them that the time available far exceeds. Like, sure, I'd love to do an extra week or two of travel, but that's not going to occupy my whole day. Sure, I'd love to read a little bit more, but after an hour of that, like I'm good, right? I don't need to be spending the whole day reading. So I think what it does is it helps me identify those things, but also it brings an awareness to like, what are the relationships that we need to be investing in, prioritize. Easier said than done. Like we've talked about this on the podcast before, like, prioritizing friendships, obviously spouses, relationship with kids, like there's only so much time and margin to do it, but that's going to be really difficult to pick those up from Jump Street, or to pick up hobbies again from Jump Street, or habits or routines or rhythms, if we can begin to start to build those into our routine right now. And I think pen to paper really helps that come to life of what's this idea I have, what's this visual I have for retirement, and then what's the reality of what that might look like on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis.
Yeah, and I think one of the conversations that Shay and I've had recently that were kind of, I wouldn't say diametrically opposed, but you know, she kind of, but I think it's a main driver in potentially what our retirement looks like. She's made the comment of like, if all of our kids stay in Ohio, which I think is unlikely, but if all our kids stay in Ohio, like I want to stay in Ohio, like I don't want to move somewhere else, or like say they all move to Texas, like she would want to go to Texas and be around like grandkids. And I'm more of like, hey, I can be there and be fun, but then I'm out, right? Like, she wants to be more of like the daycare. And I've seen,
No grandpa daycare.
Right. Like I
Yeah.
don't, I've run that race already. Right. That's to me, in my viewpoint, but like, that's a big unknown. And for me, a major thing in like what retirement looks like, and what's the compromise for that. And, the other thing you talked about is like, you're like, hey, I'd like to do more of this, more of this. I think the big thing that we have to notate there is those are the things that you want to do now, right? Or can do now as like an able body. So I think that's the other thing that we have to take stock of is like, you know, if you're 60, 50, 60, 70, I think for the most part, if you're doing what you should be doing, like you can get around. But I think once you get a little bit older, that those travel things that you're like, I'll get to that one day, like that comes off the table in a lot of ways, just because you're just not as able bodied to get around. So there's just a lot of calculus that to be done here. And again, I think the just like we talk about financial plan, like a financial plan, it's more about planning than a plan. This is not a static thing. It's something that we should revisit on the regular, because you just change your what you want to do, and the things that you interest you now is not going to be the same later. So it's really an exercise in being intentional with how you live your life, and where you save and spend your resources. That's not necessarily 100% tied to to the dollars and cents. So just interesting, again, and I think the other point I would make here is, you mentioned, the closer we get to something, the more that we can relate to it. And that's 100% true. But I do think that there are things that we can do to extrapolate out. So like, one of the things, if I talk to a pharmacist that's, brand new out of pharmacy school, and we say like, what's does success look like in 30 years? They're like, they can talk about 1 or 5 years, but 30 years, they disconnect that themselves from that reality. So I'm like, all right, well, put yourself in your parents' shoes, or a mentor's shoes. And like, I find myself doing this now where, I look at my parents and I'm like, okay, like success, maybe in this realm of their life, that's like, I view that as success, but maybe in this other realm of their life, I don't. So I kind of take those, I try to, pin myself to certain examples, and then kind of overlay my own experience and like what I would want to do to kind of create that timeline that's way far in advance, that it's hard for us as humans to connect with, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's really valuable, right? Because it then allows you to think about the reality, which is we have a finite period of time. Now,
Right.
maybe that's longer than we think, maybe it's not, but that's a great one, right? So when I think about my parents are relatively young, so they're in their mid 60s, but still, like if I put myself in their shoes, like I can look at this 20-year-ish window to get an idea of, okay, well, that's a barometer of what might health look like in 20 years. What might our situation, and what that does is it really helps with some of the picture of not just thinking about this as a future day of, hey, we're going to enjoy and live our rich life tomorrow. Like we talk about that ad nauseum on the show, right? But hey, when you start to think about it in terms of a 20 or 30 or 40-year timeline, like let's do it. Let's do it right now. I want to go back to something you said when you gave the example of you and Shay, because I think this is a really helpful exercise for partners to think through. I was visualizing when you were talking about, some of the things that you may enjoy or Shay may enjoy, or how it might be different. I was visualizing a Venn diagram, right? There's the Tim things in retirement, there's the
Yeah.
Shay things in retirement, and then there's the Tim and Shay things in retirement. And I think that's healthy, obviously, depending on what those buckets are. A lot of discussion to be had there in terms of time and location and big decisions. But I think in the context of the ideal schedule, the ideal week, that's a really good conversation to have, which is, hey, what are the things that I really want to enjoy doing? And maybe that's solo. What are the things that Jess might enjoy doing that are solo? What are the things that we desire to do together and we enjoy to do together? Right? Because you hear some of these situations and cases where, especially if you have partners that don't necessarily retire in the same timeline
Yeah.
where one is used to a quiet house and then all of a sudden the other one retires and they're together all the time. And it's like, have we discussed what this looks like, right?
Yeah. Well, and that's why like in the life planning training, like it's really important to build out a life plan for each partner, right? So when you go through the process, and we call it like lighting the torch, which is kind of creating a vision of the life plan, you do them, I might do one for you, Tim, and then I'll do one for Jess. And we want them to be, you know, there needs to be some compatibility there. So it's not like you're living on a beach and she's living, in a mountain, on a mountain somewhere. So like we have to find some common ground, but they really should be, independent of each other, meaning like both of your visions of what, that vision, needs to be possible, for you. So yeah, it's interesting, because again, I see some of the conversations and I'm like, man, I don't really want to be like I've done the raising kids, but there's some people like that is 100% what in Shay's case, she's like, that's what I would want to do. And to me, that sounds exhausting, but so we had to figure out like what that actually looks like, in the future.
But the value is have the conversation, right?
Correct.
I have a
Yeah.
hunch there's a lot of unsaid expectations, right? And that's where resentment can build up. And, it just makes sense. Like think about the percentage of time that you and Shay are together today versus like both of you are retired, or Jess and I are together today versus
Yeah.
both of us are retired. I mean, even in the busy season with kids where, yeah, sure, we're doing a lot of things together, but, oftentimes, especially with the four boys, we're divide and conquer, right? So, how much time really from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m., like what percentage of the day are we together? And of course that looks different on the weekends or vacation, but I think these are all just good things, to be thinking about. One of the other conversations I want to have is I think it's important we define what does retirement mean, right? Because not only does the plan depend upon it in terms of how much do we need, what are the potential buckets in which we're going to save, how much in each of those buckets, and eventually how are we going to withdraw from those buckets, timing of Social Security, all the things that would depend upon it. But what does the definition of retirement mean? And making sure we're not operating under the assumption that it means the same thing for everyone, right? Does it mean a traditional timeline to retirement? And what does that mean? Is that 63? Is that 65? Is it early retirement? And if so, why? I think it's important to define the why, not just I want to stop working, right? But what am I retiring to? Especially since we're going to have a longer timeline retirement. Is that 57? Is that 55? Is that 53? What does that mean? And a lot of variations in between, right? Could it be that you go from full-time work, you say, hey, I'm going to work full-time to 55, but then I enjoy what I want to do, but I want to have a little bit more flexibility, a little bit more freedom, and I don't want to do it at the same pace. So I'm working part-time, and what are the implications of that, right? And then, of course, if we have two partners involved, like what do those look like individually? And then what does that mean collectively for the plan? So perhaps stating the obvious here, but I think that especially in a field like pharmacy, where there's so many opportunities to do part-time work, consulting, right? Hourly type of work that can shift over time, that it's important we define what that retirement means, right? Because so much of the plan is going to depend on that.
Yeah. And I can say like growing up, like I felt like retirement was more of the destination where, I grew up in New Jersey. So it was get to 60 or 65 or somewhere in between those ages, completely stop work, snowbird. A lot of people in New Jersey will retire to Florida, do that for a couple of years, and eventually sell the North, the Jersey spot, and then fully retire, in a community in Florida somewhere, which is kind of like what my parents did more or less. I just think it's so much more nuanced, and there's just so much more gray today, for a variety of reasons, right? So like, unfortunately, I've been seeing just a lot more stories of like in the older generation baby boomers, like going back to work, not
Yep.
because they want to, but because they have to. because they, didn't, do enough of the numbers focus, X's and O's, was kind of hand to mouth, in terms of like how they live their life, in the accumulation phase. Some people are just going back to work because they haven't done the work in terms of like, what do they retire into? So they kind of lost that structure, and that's, again, that's not a bad thing. I think the sandwich generation, that we've told, is like you're being kind of pulled both from maybe, dependents that are your children, but also dependents that maybe be your parents now. So I think that's changing. I think we're seeing more encore careers and twilight careers. I think you're seeing more people travel in retirement, which I think is a good thing, because I think there's just more of an industry around retirees and travel and communities. I think you're seeing more medical tourism because our healthcare expenses have gone awry. So people can get, better care, maybe in Mexico or Canada, that type of thing. But, I think another important exercise is to kind of almost like go through that checklist and be like, okay, like what interests you? Like, do you want to full stop working? And I think most people, especially if they feel burnt out by their career, they're like, absolutely. But I think there is a honeymoon period of that. And they're like, okay, well, maybe I want to consult, or maybe like I want to get more involved with like my state association,
Yep.
and be more of a mentor or a voice there, or maybe it's more involvement in your church or community, or, teaching classes, things like that. So I think it's good to kind of look through those things that are available to you in terms of like outlets and that provide structure and meaning and purpose. And again, I've read people that have like sold their companies and have made millions of dollars, and then they play Xbox for a year and just relax because they're so burnt down. They're like, I need to start another company. I need to,
And then they're burnt out from playing Xbox. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think, again, it's kind of more of, and that, like, that's okay to do that, to like retire at 62 and then just like chill. Like, that's fine. Or travel, like, like you never did before. Like, I think that's fine too. But to me, it goes back to planning. And again, it can very much be from a dollars and cents perspective, but just like from a life plan, what is it that what is a wealthy life today? What is a wealthy life tomorrow? And like, what's driving you? And I think understanding that retirement isn't it's a patchwork. It's not this finish line that you see on a commercial where you're sitting on a beach, drinking cocktails. Like, that's maybe a portion of your retirement, but that's also maybe a portion of your career right now. So I think this picture is sold that is more black and white than I think than what is actually reality in terms of the nuance of how you spend your time and dollars and, post career. So I look at retirement, Tim, to kind of actually answer the question. I look at it as just the ability not to rely on a paycheck day to day. Like, that to me is like, that's the simplest of the definition.
I'm so glad you said that, because I think that, even as you talked about burnout, right? I was thinking about what is the formula for burnout, right? It is a less than ideal work environment. And that could be for a variety of reasons. That could be the culture of the organization. That could be the people you work with. That could be the patients you serve, combination of all the above, right? Misalignment of interests with role. I mean, a lot of things that could be categorized as less than ideal work environment. It's that plus needing to be financially dependent on that less than ideal work environment. To me, that is where so often burnout comes from when I talk with pharmacists, is that I'm in an environment that is not ideal for whatever reason, but I'm financially dependent on the paycheck associated with being in that environment, right? And I think when we dig deeper, often what people are yearning for when we talk about retirement is options, flexibility, independence, whatever word we want to use. And it may not necessarily mean not working, but things can change significantly when you're working because you want to, or you're working because you're in an environment that maybe you can take a little bit of a pay cut, or you can work part-time or whatever, because you're at a point of financial independence that you're no longer dependent on or in need of that paycheck, right? I think that the optionality, the flexibility is often what I'm hearing is the desire. And so how do we plan that? Because I think a lot of things can change. Like, you asked me, I think a week or two in the office, you're like, hey, Tim, when do you want to retire? Right? When do you want to kind of stop doing this? And I initially answered that of like, I kind of have this arbitrary age of like 50 in my mind. And, where that is coming from is I'm thinking about, well, the age of 50, that's 7 or 8 years from now, three of my kids in theory are out of the house. My fourth is kind of on that pathway. But I love what I do. So I'm not talking about retirement. What I'm talking about, I think, is just the optionality or the flexibility, both financially and time, to continue to find the pathway of doing the work that I enjoy at whatever capacity for whatever life looks like in that phase, right? Because I don't know, back to the conversation you were talking about of you and Shay and the kids and grandkids and where people live, like, I don't know what that will look like in 10 or 15 years. So if I have 4 boys that are in Central Ohio versus I have 4 boys that are dispersed throughout the country and we'd love to travel and go see them, well, the level of flexibility that would be needed could be completely different. So I think sometimes we feel the pressure to like define this, and it's hard to define, right? When you look at what does 10 years look like from now? I don't know.
It's funny, you say that. Like I almost envision like, oh, like it'd be great to retire so then I can go and like if Olivia is at just making up a school, Purdue, like I could go and like visit her and like watch a football game or whatever. But then like
You can do that now.
yeah, and then it's like, all right, let's party. And then it's like, well, I gotta go to class. Like the week has started and like I'm high-fiving myself and she's like, you gotta get out of here, Dad. It's like I'm not gonna be like on campus, like hanging out with her. So it's like in my mind, I'm like, oh yeah, retirement. I can just like go and visit my kids and do like that. But like and this is my argument with like like watching grandkids and being daycare is like my kids, they have to live their own life too. And sometimes the family dynamic of like just being ultra present can be good, but it also can be disruptive. And it's just like this idea of like, I'm just going to retire to tour the United States to visit my kids and go to football games. And that like, it doesn't really match reality. The other thing that I would mention, when you're talking about burnout, I think the only thing that I would edit in what you're saying, and I brought this up before, it makes sense because we're kind of talking about, work and tied to a paycheck, is I just think that burnout comes from like an environment. So I wouldn't even say a work environment. It could be a home environment.
Oh, sure.
So I think that's one of the things that we conflate too much is like we always associate burnout with job, but if the home front is not ideal, and that could be just like, where you're going through a divorce or you have family members that have health issues or whatever, or you have your own health issue or whatever that is, like that contributes to burnout that I think lay at the feet of the employer too often. So, and it kind of maybe goes on to like what we may talk about next, which is like, your mental health, your physical health, all the things that are really, really important in retirement, I think are just, they're also important in the accumulation, because at the end of the day, there's just so many people that I think are just worn out because there's so much on our plate, and, we're just trying to adult as best we can, but it can be overwhelming. And I think, oftentimes it's like, oh, my job's burning me out, but it's everything else that's kind of ancillary to that as well.
Yeah, and just to add on that, it also can be, as you brought up on, I think it was on 440 on the career identity episode, even in the workplace, if the workplace is the attribution to the burnout, that can often be self-inflicted and have nothing to do with the organization, right? I think we see this a lot, with pharmacists. And so, are we kind of creating our own challenges there? I do want to come back to the health piece that you just mentioned, right? Because I think health can become one of the biggest assets as we think about the financial plan. But I also want to talk about something that was coming up as you were talking about the Purdue example, right? And you're going to see Olivia at Purdue. Maybe that's prophetic, by the way. Maybe she's going to become a Boilermaker,
Maybe. I don't know if they have a good swim program, but that's how she's thinking. So
I think they do. But you gave that example, right? You go into the football game for a weekend and she's like, Dad, get out of here. The the thought that was coming up though is like when I think about, answering that question of like, hey, when might you retire? And I say 50, and then I follow that up with, well, really what I'm talking about is just having the flexibility or the options. The thought that came right behind that is like, we have that right now. And I think that's an example of, do we fall into this trap of that future state and thinking that this rich life to be lived is something that's actually right in front of us right now. So, we're in a position of, thankfully, we own our own business. You're taking a 2-month sabbatical. I just took a 1-month sabbatical. We've got a great team. Sure, it doesn't mean we can go do whatever we want whenever we want, but like, is that not the flexibility like I'm talking about as a future state, right? And so I just bring that up as an opportunity, I think, for all of us to reflect of like, are we potentially describing something as a desired future state that in fact we have at least parts of it in front of us right now, but we're missing it because we're thinking about the future of it?
Well, and if I'm a pharmacist and I feel like I'm kind of stuck in that, like, I'm clocking shifts at a hospital or whatever that is, I'm like what you just described sounds like a perfect like encore for here. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Um, so and I want to just say that like being able to take a sabbatical and like have that flexibility that like that doesn't like that's not afforded to everyone, and we understand that, and I think that we've been very fortunate and lucky, Tim, of like what we build and the team that we build and the clients that we have, and just this business has been great to us. But we talk with a lot of pharmacists that are seeking that, and I think that can be found within pharmacy, but sometimes not, right? And sometimes it's really being intentional with the plan and how you spend your time and how you navigate the plan. That's really important, and the career perspective is very important to this. So, but yeah, like I agree with you. It's almost like we're conditioned to seek greener grass somewhere, and it's like I'm I I'm fine where I'm at, in terms of like I feel like and can we get better in certain, absolutely. There's like, it's not like
Sure.
we've never made it, like you don't make it, like you're still iterating, trying to figure things out. Yeah, and I think sometimes people that we work with kind of get caught into the web of like, you know, I have to do this to check off this list to do, and I think if we actually peel back what we've done so far and make course corrections that I think could free up time and flexibility. And sometimes, Tim, in my experience, it's just the capacity to say no, that often is a driving force of like, oh my goodness, like this is so overwhelming. So again, I think it goes back to like intentionality in where we are at in space and time, and just looking at how can we improve, how can we optimize. And again, it's not just a dollars and cents thing, it's everything else. So I'm with you. Like, it's a question that I think about, or I've been thinking about more recently, in terms of like, what does retirement look like? And I think probably because of sabbaticals, but um I'm kind of more of a wait and see. Like, I don't really feel the need to pull the plug on anything, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and a lot of variables that can change, right? I
Yeah.
mean, what does it look like in 10, 15, 20 years in terms of our partners, our kids, our parents' health? I mean, so many things that might have an influence on how we're spending our time, or what that timeline is for how much we're working and in what capacity, and of course, what the financial plan needs to be to support it. I do want to wrap up by talking about the health piece that you mentioned a few moments ago, right? Because I think the question here, which maybe some of our financial nerds will roll their eyes at a little bit, is like, what good is financial freedom, financial independence, achieving these goals, right? If health is ultimately going to limit what we're able to do. And we talk about in retirement planning all of the calculations, the investment returns, asset location, calculating the nest egg. We don't talk about exercise, sleep, nutrition, right? And financial planning lives in a silo, and so often does our health. But these are so interconnected, right? As we think about how does our health intersect with our financial plan? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's one of the things you hear with, from retirees that don't prioritize this is like they wish they would, and anything, whether it's your health or relationship, it takes work, right? You can't just wake up and phone it in, right? So to me, I look at the health as like there's some things that you can control and there's some things that you can't control, right? So, control the things that you can control. So, and I think like you don't have to be in the gym throwing around like large weight. Like go for a walk, walking outside, vitamin D, movement. I think can be like a meditative thing involved in it if you're doing it by yourself. I think can just add years to your life. So definitely like movement. I also just think of like, I kind of talk about like we live in a microwave society. I think like just cooking your own meals and like that to me is like one of the things for my sabbatical. I'm like, I always want to try to do X, Y, and Z. So I have a list of things that I just want to do. But like in the hustle and bustle of life, and sometimes I do these on the weekends. Like it's just very much not that. So I think that's important. I also think that like it's not just your physical body, it's also like your mind. So like read, write, think about things. I think meditation practice is also really important. So those would be, I think outside the obvious of just your physical health. But it takes work, for anything. And I think, those are things that I think if you talk to retirees that are maybe like struggling with their health, they're like, I wish I would have done a little bit more, to pay attention to this because now I can't do some of the basic, daily things of living. And it really impedes not just their day to day, but also their financial situation because, maybe they have to just spend a lot more money for, a nurse and aide, home health care, that type of thing. So, it's something that you don't want to sleep on because I think it can come back to bite you, big time in later in life.
I am excited to see where a lot of the tech evolves on this in the future, like to start to integrate some of these things together. So like I think about my own situation, I track certain things in an Aura ring, right? Looking at sleep
Yeah.
patterns and exercise. And it even has an indicator of like, what's your actual age and then what's like your cardiovascular age according to your metrics, right? Which would be helpful from like a financial planning perspective. Or you think about what you're tracking on like a Apple Watch or a device, So
Yeah.
we have all these different areas that we're tracking and they all live in a silo. And you can start to see a future state where, your up-to-date financial information gets intersected with these different aspects and that feeds into the planning process, as well. So maybe a business idea there if somebody wants
Yeah.
to
Could
run with
be.
that one. So, well, good stuff. I think the theme as we wrap up here is, of course, we all know that retirement planning requires us to do the quantitative work as we look at calculating what is enough when it comes to saving for retirement. How much is enough? Where do those assets need to live? What do we need to be saving and working towards today? But there's also this whole other side, right? As we look at preparing for entering into retirement, it's not just something that we arrive at, but something that we need to be designing all the way along and preparing for as well. Coming up on the show, I hope you will continue to tune in to the podcast, and we'd love if you would share it with others as well. Coming up, we've got an episode talking about scarcity mindset, even among high earners. And then following that, we're going to be talking about early retirement and is early retirement as good as it sounds. So as always, thanks for taking time to listen. And Tim, good stuff. We'll be back out of here in a couple weeks. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Scripted Wealth, Money and Meaning for Pharmacists. If you enjoyed the conversation, be sure to subscribe, leave us a rating and review, and share the show with a friend or colleague. It really helps more pharmacists discover the show and join us on the journey toward living a rich life today and tomorrow. And if today's episode got you thinking about your own financial plan, retirement goals, or what a rich life means for you, we'd love to help. You can learn more about our fee-only comprehensive financial planning services by visiting yfbwealth.com. And finally, an important reminder that the content in this podcast is provided to you for informational purposes only and is not intended to provide and should not be relied on for investment or any other advice. Information of the podcast and corresponding material should not be construed as a solicitation or offer to buy or sell any investment or related financial products. For more information, you can visit yfpwealth.com/disclaimer. Thanks so much for listening. Have a great rest of your week.